The Galactic Council's threat assessment chamber was never meant to inspire awe. Unlike the Grand Rotunda, with its sweeping views of 3 spiral arms, or the Species Integration Plaza, with its carefully calibrated atmospheres, the assessment chamber had been designed with brutal efficiency. Tiered seating for the 3,000-member species faced a central podium. No ornamentation, no comfort. Just the facts of survival in a universe where every new intelligence might be the one to end them all. "The classification stands," announced Senior Administrator Veltar, the Jafferian delegate whose crystalline appendages caught the harsh light. Species 2998, designation Vorak, remains categorized as apex predator. The quarantine zone will be expanded by 6 parsecs. Dr. Kestra Voss watched the proceedings from the human delegation's bench. Jaw clenched so tight, her teeth might crack. Another delay. Another expansion of restrictions. Another victory for fear over understanding. "Point of inquiry," she called, standing before being recognized. 3,000 representatives shifted uncomfortably. The Jafferian's crystal limbs clinked with irritation as they pivoted toward her. "The Terran Institute recognizes that protocols exist for a reason," Kestra began, feeling the weight of disapproval settling across her shoulders. "But we've maintained this classification for 73 standard cycles, with 0 direct contact attempts. For good reason," Veltar's translation unit clicked. "The psionic emissions from the Vorak homeworld have driven 17 exploration vessels to crew-wide psychosis. The quarantine exists to protect us all. Dr. Voss, we haven't made contact because we keep trying the same approach." Kestra tapped her datapad, projecting a neural activity chart into the chamber's center. Every vessel approached with standard communication arrays. Every time, the crews reported experiencing overwhelming dread, visual hallucinations, and cognitive collapse. Yet the Vorak never physically attacked. A Melosian representative's tentacles rippled in the universal gesture for dismissal. "The Apex classification isn't merely about physical violence. Doctor, psychological warfare is still warfare." "Or it's failed communication," Kestra countered. "Our neurological review team believes the silence reported around Vorak isn't absence. It's signal. Complex electromagnetic patterns designed for neural reception, not our crude audiovisual interfaces." Administrator Veltar's crystalline form grew rigid, a sign of extreme displeasure among Jafferians. "The Council recognizes Dr. Voss's distinguished career in xenobiology, but this borders on dangerous speculation. The Apex classification serves our collective security." Kestra straightened her spine. She'd anticipated this reaction, had prepared for it during sleepless nights, reviewing the classified Vorak reports. "I'm formally proposing Deep Space Research Expedition 847 to approach the Vorak homeworld with modified equipment and protocols. 1 ship, volunteer crew, new communication paradigms." The chamber erupted. 3,000 representatives chattering, clicking, whistling, and vibrating their objections. Administrator Veltar struck the ceremonial chime 3 times to restore order. But the cacophony only subsided when the ancient Peluvian delegate, a being who rarely spoke, rose from their cushion. "We have called Dr. Voss reckless before," the Peluvian's voice rasped through their translator, "when she integrated with the crystalline entities of Tau Ceti. We called her mad when she deciphered the quantum fluctuations of the Ziril. Yet here we stand, with both species as council members." Their compound eyes turned to Kestra. "But this time, Doctor, you propose to touch the untouchable, to hear what has driven others insane." Kestra nodded. "That's precisely why it must be me." "And if you're wrong?" asked Veltar. Kestra allowed herself a small, tight smile. "Then I'll be too insane to apologize." The vote, when it came 3 days later, passed by the narrowest margin in Council history. 1 ship, 4 months. A chance to prove that the galaxy's most feared intelligence might be its most misunderstood. As she packed her equipment in her laboratory at the Terran Institute, Kestre wondered if her colleagues were right. Perhaps she had finally gone too far. The Intrepid was not a warship, but neither was it the research vessel Kestre had requested. Its gleaming hull bristled with defensive systems, and its crew quarters had been retrofitted with psionic dampening fields that made Kestre's teeth ache. "The Council may have approved your mission," Commander Zoran said during their first briefing, "but they didn't approve suicide." The weathered military officer glared at her across the tactical display. "We'll maintain the quarantine boundary until your equipment is fully tested. Any sign of neural contamination, and we retreat." Kestre examined the crew manifest. Besides Zoran, the Council had assigned Dr. Yilan Koresh, a reluctant neurolinguist whose papers on interspecies communication Kestre had long admired, and Professor Venth, a safety protocols expert whose perpetual frown suggested he expected disaster at any moment. "Commander," Kestre said, "the entire point of this mission is to cross the boundary. The Vorak emissions increase exponentially as we approach their system. We need exposure to properly calibrate our instruments." "Controlled exposure," Venth interjected, adjusting his collar nervously. Previous expeditions reported effects beginning at approximately 0.8 light-years from the homeworld. We should establish incremental approach protocols. "Previous expeditions weren't looking for communication," Kestre countered. "They were expecting threats. So threats are what they perceived." She activated her own display, showing the neural mapping she'd been developing. "Dr. Koresh, you've studied the Melosian dream speech. This isn't so different, just faster, more complex." Dr. Koresh straightened her spine, dark eyes scrutinizing Kestre's data. "I've reviewed your proposals, Dr. Voss. The pattern recognition algorithms are impressive, but untested. The Melosians communicate through shared chemical signals that trigger synchronized neural states. You're suggesting the Vorak broadcast directly into other species' consciousness." "Exactly," Kestre's eyes lit up. "Imagine a species that evolved without sound or light as primary communication methods. Pure neural transmission. Imagine a predator that evolved to paralyze its prey through fear," Commander Zoran countered, arms crossed. "Either way, we approach with caution." As the Intrepid departed from the Council station, Kestre watched the stars stretch into lines of light. She'd won the first battle, getting the mission approved. Now came the harder part, proving that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their adaptability, but their willingness to listen to the silence between stars. Day 37 of the expedition found them at the edge of the quarantine zone. The Intrepid hovered just beyond the invisible boundary that had been established after the last failed contact attempt. "Neural dampening fields at maximum," reported Lieutenant Saris from her station. "Life support systems nominal. All crew have been issued emergency psionic inhibitors." Commander Zoran stood at the center of the bridge, hands clasped behind his back. "Dr. Voss, your final opportunity to reconsider our approach vector." Kestre looked up from her equipment calibrations. The specialized neural interface she designed lay on the workstation before her, a delicate crown of sensors and processors that would, theoretically, allow her to receive and interpret the Vorak transmissions without experiencing the overwhelming fear response that had crippled previous expeditions. "The approach vector is correct, Commander," she said. "The Vorak homeworld orbits a red dwarf star. The emissions are strongest along the planetary ecliptic. And you're certain your device will protect you?" Professor Venth asked, eyeing the neural interface with undisguised skepticism. "It's not meant to block the signals," Kestre explained for what felt like the 100th time. "It's designed to translate them, filter the raw neural stimulation into comprehensible patterns." Dr. Koresh approached, her fingers tracing the air above the interface without touching it. "You've incorporated elements from my Melosian translation matrix." "With modifications," Kestre acknowledged. "The Melosians communicate emotion concepts, I believe the Vorak communicates something more fundamental. Pure consciousness. Commander Zoran cleared his throat. We cross the boundary in 5 minutes. All personnel to alert stations. Dr. Voss. I want your word that you'll disconnect at the first sign of cognitive distress. Kestra met his eyes. I need enough data to establish a baseline. Some distress is inevitable. Kestra, Koresh said softly, using her first name for the first time since the mission began. We've all read the reports. The Lancer expedition. The 17 souls who never recovered their sanity. This isn't a game. I know. Kestra's voice dropped to match Koresh's intensity. That's why I'm doing this. 17 ships. And not once did the Vorak initiate hostile action. Not once did they pursue. They simply exist, broadcasting, while we run away screaming. The ship's alert system chimed as they crossed the invisible line. For a moment, nothing happened. Boundary crossed. Lieutenant Saris announced, all systems nominal. No change in external readings. Commander Zoran allowed himself a small smile. Perhaps the quarantine was overstated after all. No, Kestra said, her eyes fixed on her instruments. The emissions are there, subtle at this distance, but present. Set course for the next waypoint. As the Intrepid moved deeper into the quarantine zone, the effects began. Subtle at first, crew members reporting strange dreams, momentary disorientation, unexplained emotional responses. The ship's psionic dampening fields strained against the invisible tide washing over them. By day 42, they'd reached the halfway point to the Vorak system. Dr. Koresh found Kestra in the observation lounge, staring out at the red dwarf star that now burned visibly against the black. The crew is deteriorating, Koresh said without preamble. 2 engineers requested sedation today. Lieutenant Saris broke down crying during her shift for no reason. Even with the dampening fields, we're feeling it. Kestri nodded, her own eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. I know. I've been monitoring the progression. She turned to face her colleague. It's time for the interface. Zoran will never approve, not yet. He doesn't have to. Kestra's hand went to her pocket, where the neural interface had been miniaturized to a slim circlet. My quarters have an isolated monitoring system. I can collect preliminary data without risking the crew. Koresh's expression hardened. That wasn't the agreement. The agreement was to make contact. That's what I intend to do. You're as stubborn as they said. Koresh shook her head. The stories about you at the Institute, I thought they were exaggerated. Kestra smiled thinly. Only the boring ones. She hesitated, then added, I'd welcome your assistance, Dr. Koresh. Your expertise could be invaluable in interpreting what I receive. For a long moment, Koresh said nothing. Then, 20 minutes. Neural inhibitors on standby. At the first sign of coherence degradation, I pull the plug myself. Deal! In Kestra's quarters, the 2 scientists worked in tense silence. Koresh established monitoring protocols, while Kestra made final adjustments to the interface. The theory is simple, Kestra explained, as she positioned the circlet on her head. Our brains interpret the Vorak transmissions as fear, because that's our default response to overwhelming neural stimulation. The interface should modulate the input to something my consciousness can process. Theory is always simple, Koresh muttered, checking the restraints that would keep Kestra from harming herself if the experiment went wrong. Reality tends to be messier. Speaking of messy, Kestra said with forced lightness, if this doesn't work, tell Zoran I was right anyway. Before Koresh could respond, Kestra activated the interface. The universe exploded behind her eyes. Later, she would struggle to describe it. Colors that weren't colors. Sounds that weren't sounds. A rushing torrent of pure experience pouring through circuits never meant to contain it. Her consciousness expanded, contracted, fragmented into a billion shards of perception. She felt Koresh's panic as a distant ripple. heard alarms as underwater echoes. The restraints bit into her arms as her body convulsed. But these sensations were trivial compared to the vast ocean of awareness she now swam in. Patterns emerged, rhythms, repetitions, not language as she understood it, but something older, more fundamental. The transmission wasn't a message but a presence, a consciousness reaching out to touch other consciousnesses. When Kestre opened her eyes, Koresh was hovering over her, hypodermic poised to deliver a neural suppressant. "Don't," Kestre croaked, her throat raw from screaming. "I'm here. I'm me." "Your neural patterns were chaotic," Koresh said, not lowering the hypodermic. "Completely incoherent for 6 minutes." "Not incoherent." Kestre struggled to sit up. "Just vast, different processing architecture." She gestured weakly toward her data terminal. "Did the interface record it all?" "Yes, but they're not attacking." "Yilan." Kestre grabbed Koresh's wrist. "They're reaching out, trying every possible neural frequency, pattern, amplitude. They don't know how to talk to us because they don't understand how limited our perception is." Koresh slowly lowered the hypodermic. "You got actual communication?" "Not yet, but I felt the intention." Kestre's eyes were fever bright. "We need to get closer. I need more data to refine the interface." "Zoran will never—" The door to Kestre's quarters slid open, revealing Commander Zoran and Professor Venth. Both men looked grim. "He already knows," Zoran said flatly. "Ship systems detected the power surge from your private experiment. Half the crew is experiencing heightened anxiety. And you thought this was the time to go rogue?" Kestre straightened, pulling the interface from her head. "I've confirmed my hypothesis. The Vorak aren't attacking. They're attempting contact in the only way they know how." "Your hypothesis is noted," Zoran said coldly. "As is your violation of mission protocols. We're holding position here while the Council reconsiders the expedition parameters." "That could take weeks," Kestre protested. "Indeed." Zoran's expression was implacable. "During which time, you'll refrain from further unsanctioned experiments. The interface is now restricted technology, accessible only with my direct authorization." After they left, Koresh remained, watching as Kestre slumped back against her pillows. "You knew this would happen," Koresh accused softly. "You knew they'd restrict the interface once they saw its effects." "Yes." "Then why—" "Because now I have baseline data." Kestre's smile was thin but genuine. "And because they're watching the interface." She reached under her pillow and withdrew a small data module. "They're not watching the expedition logs I've been modifying for the past 5 weeks." Koresh's eyes widened. "You wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what? Continue the mission we were sent to accomplish?" Kestre sat up straighter. "The Council authorized this expedition because they're desperate. Yilan, 3,000 species locked in bureaucratic paralysis, too afraid to expand, explore, or evolve because of classifications like apex predator. If I have to bend a few rules to break that deadlock, so be it." "What exactly are you planning?" Kestre's gaze turned toward the viewport, where the red dwarf star burned like a distant ember. "The Intrepid carries 3 long-range shuttles, each one capable of automated return to the ship if necessary." "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life." Kestre turned back to Koresh, her expression intense. "Help me finish what we started, or report me to Zoran. Either way, I'm going to make contact." For a long moment, Koresh said nothing. Then she sighed deeply. "The stories really didn't do you justice. You're not just reckless. You're certifiable." "Is that a yes?" Koresh closed her eyes briefly. I'll help you refine the interface data while you recover from neural shock. We'll discuss your shuttle hijacking fantasy when you can stand without swaying." It was a start. Kestre would take it. Over the next week, as the Intrepid maintained its position and the Council debated their fate, Kestre and Koresh worked in secret. Using the data from Kestra's brief exposure, they refined the interface algorithms, creating a more robust filter for the Vorak transmissions. The problem is bandwidth, Kestra explained, as they reviewed neural simulations in Koresh's lab. Human consciousness operates within certain parameters. The Vorak are broadcasting across a much wider spectrum. Like trying to pour an ocean through a drinking straw, Koresh murmured, manipulating the holographic model of synaptic responses. But what if we don't need the whole ocean? What if we just need a representative sample? The idea was elegantly simple. Instead of attempting to process the entirety of the Vorak transmissions, the interface would selectively sample across the spectrum, building a composite picture that a human mind could comprehend. It's still risky, Koresh warned. Even filtered, this level of neural stimulation could cause permanent changes to your cognitive architecture. Every first contact changes us, Kestra replied. That's rather the point. On day 56 of the expedition, their opportunity came. Commander Zoran called a ship-wide meeting to discuss the Council's latest directives. With security focused on managing the increasingly anxious crew, Kestra made her move. The shuttle bay was minimally staffed. A single ensign, already jumpy from the ambient Vorak emissions, was easily convinced that Kestra had authorization to inventory equipment in Shuttle 3. Once inside, she worked quickly. The modified neural interface, disguised as standard medical equipment, was installed beside the pilot's seat. Navigation was pre-programmed with a course to the Vorak homeworld. She was running final diagnostics when the shuttle bay door opened. Kestra's hand moved to the emergency launch controls, but she hesitated when she saw who had entered. Dr. Koresh stood in the doorway, a small case clutched in her hands. Behind her, to Kestra's surprise, loomed Professor Venth, looking even more nervous than usual. "If you're going to stop me," Kestra began. "We're coming with you," Koresh interrupted. She stepped into the shuttle, setting the case down on a jump seat. "I've spent the past week refining the interface. If you're going to fry your brain making first contact, you should at least have the best possible equipment." Kestra blinked in surprise. "And you?" she asked Venth. The safety expert adjusted his glasses. "Someone needs to ensure proper protocols are followed. Since you seem determined to ignore them entirely, I thought, perhaps, adaptations could be made on site." A slow smile spread across Kestra's face. "Welcome aboard, then." "Don't look so pleased," Koresh said sharply. "This is still monumentally stupid, but the Vorak emissions are affecting everyone now. Half the crew can't sleep. Zoran's on the edge of ordering a full retreat. If there's any chance you're right about this being communication rather than attack." "I am right," Kestra said with quiet certainty. "And we're about to prove it." The shuttle launch caused exactly the chaos Kestra had anticipated. By the time Commander Zoran realized what was happening, they were already accelerating toward the Vorak system. The Intrepid's tractor beams unable to lock on through the increasing psionic interference. "He's hailing us," Venth reported from the communication station, his voice tight with stress. "Of course he is." Kestra didn't look up from her preparations. "Tell him we're implementing Council Directive 847 as approved." Technically true, if selectively interpreted. As they approached the Vorak homeworld, the effects intensified. Even with Koresh's improved interface design, the ambient emissions battered their consciousness. Venth was the first to show signs of distress, his normally precise movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. "It's like being watched," he gasped, pressing his palms against his temples. "A billion eyes, all staring, judging." Koresh administered a mild sedative, then turned to Kestra. "Your turn," she said, holding up the refined interface. "Whatever you're going to do it now, before we're all reduced to gibbering wrecks." Kestra nodded, settling into the pilot's seat as Koresh attached the interface. This version was more elegant, a series of nanoscale receivers embedded in a simple headband. It would modulate the Vorak transmissions in real time, theoretically, allowing Kestre to maintain conscious control while experiencing the alien communication. "If I lose coherence," Kestre said, taking Koresh's hand briefly, "activate the autopilot return sequence. Get back to the Intrepid." "Shut up and focus," Koresh replied, but she squeezed Kestre's hand before stepping back. Kestre activated the interface. The initial surge was just as overwhelming as before, a tsunami of consciousness crashing against the shores of her mind. But this time, the interface performed as designed, channeling the flood into manageable streams, translating incomprehensible vastness into patterns her brain could process. She saw, felt, knew the Vorak homeworld as they approached. A planet of perpetual storms. Electrical discharges arcing between towering structures that weren't buildings, but the Vorak themselves. Colonial organisms of immense complexity. Rooted to the planet, yet reaching into space with tendrils of pure energy. They were aware of the shuttle. Had been aware of every expedition that had ever approached their world. Had reached out each time, trying to establish connection, baffled by the limited, fragmented consciousness that fled in terror from their greeting. "Taking us down," Kestre heard herself say, her voice distant to her own ears. Her hands moved across the controls, guiding the shuttle toward the planet's surface. "Kestre, no!" Koresh's voice penetrated the interface's translation matrix. "The atmospheric conditions. We haven't prepared for landing." But Kestre could see, feel, know that the Vorak were creating a safe zone, calming the electrical storms in a small region where the shuttle could land. They were curious about these fragmented beings, these limited consciousnesses that kept approaching, then retreating. They wanted to understand. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer, buffeted by winds, but protected from the worst of the electrical activity by an invisible corridor of calm. Below, the surface of the planet came into view, a landscape of undulating structures that pulsed with energy and life. "My God," whispered Venth, momentarily lucid despite his distress. "They're not separate entities. The entire planet is a single superorganism." "Not quite," Kestre murmured, the interface translating concepts that had no direct human equivalence. "More like a collective, individual nodes of a distributed consciousness." The shuttle landed on a flat expanse that seemed to have been created specifically for their arrival. Through the viewport, they could see the nearest Vorak structure, a towering spire of what looked like crystalline biological material, crackling with internal energy. "They're waiting," Kestre said, rising from her seat. The interface was now translating efficiently enough that she could function, though the experience remained disorienting. "They want direct contact." "Kestre, you can't go out there," Koresh protested, grabbing her arm. "The atmosphere is perfectly breathable in this zone," Kestre finished. "They've modified it for us. Even if that's true, the psionic emissions at this range are what we came for." Kestre gently removed Koresh's hand. "This is it. Yilan. First contact. Real contact. Not just ships passing in the night." Before either of her companions could object further, Kestre activated the airlock. As the outer door opened, a rush of warm, humid air entered the shuttle. Analyzers confirmed what the interface had already told her. Oxygen levels suitable for human respiration. No detectable toxins. Kestre stepped onto the surface of the Vorak homeworld. The ground beneath her boots was firm, but slightly resilient, like living tissue. The air smelled of ozone and something else, a complex biochemical signature that reminded her of petrichor, the scent of earth after rain. 20 meters away, the crystalline spire pulsed with increased intensity. A tendril of energy, not quite electricity, not quite light, extended toward her. Through the interface, Kestre understood this was a greeting, an invitation, a focusing of attention. "Hello," she said aloud, though she knew vocalization was irrelevant. Her neural patterns, filtered through the interface, were what the Vorak perceived. The tendril of energy touched her, not physically, But along pathways the interface had established. Consciousness met consciousness. Not the overwhelming flood of before, but a careful, respectful contact. Different but same, came the concept. Not in words, but in pure understanding. Long awaited. Fear-bringer becomes bridge-builder. Kestra's mind expanded to meet the contact. Through the Vorax perception, she glimpsed their reality. A species evolved to exist as both matter and energy. Their thoughts transmitted across vast distances. Their consciousness both individual and collective. They had watched the galaxy's species evolve, observed the formation of the Council, witnessed the first tentative explorations of their system. Each time, they had reached out in greeting, only to encounter minds too limited to comprehend their communication, interpreting their presence as terror. Apex predator. Kestra thought, transmitted, sending the concept as she understood it. A ripple of something like amusement passed through the connection. Apex communicator, came the correction. We speak to all hear, few understand. With a flash of insight, Kestra realized the truth. The Vorak weren't predators at all. They were facilitators. Their vast consciousness capable of bridging the neural gaps between different species, translating between minds that could never directly communicate. But their power, unfiltered, overwhelmed most organic neural systems, like trying to conduct a conversation with a whisper that registered as a scream. We can help each other, Kestra offered, sending images of the Council, the 3,000 species struggling to communicate despite their profound differences. Yes, came the response, simple yet profound. Bridge builder, silence interpreter, we have waited. The connection lingered for what might have been minutes or hours, information flowing between them at speeds no conventional language could match. When it finally ended, Kestra found herself still standing on the resilient surface, Koresh and Venth now beside her, their faces masks of wonder and fear. What happened? Koresh asked, her medical scanner humming as she checked Kestra's vital signs. You've been standing here, completely still, for nearly 40 minutes. Kestra smiled, feeling the weight of new understanding settling into her mind. I've been talking with our new allies. The return journey to the Intrepid was tense. Commander Zoran had moved the ship to the edge of the system, hovering just within communication range, prepared to abandon them if necessary. This is Shuttle 3 to Intrepid, Kestra transmitted as they approached. Mission successful. Requesting permission to dock. A long silence followed before Zoran's voice crackled through the speaker. Shuttle 3. Transmit cognitive verification protocols for all personnel. Kestra exchanged glances with her companions. The standard verification would confirm they weren't under external influence. A reasonable precaution, given the circumstances. Transmitting now, she replied, activating the shuttle's medical systems to compile their neural patterns. The interface had been removed, its data securely stored. Another long pause, then, verification accepted. Approach on Vector 117 Mark III. Medical team standing by. As the shuttle docked with the Intrepid, Kestra felt the first flicker of doubt. The Vorak had shared so much, their nature, their history, their potential as allies. But would anyone believe her? Would the Council accept that their most feared predator was actually their greatest potential partner? Commander Zoran met them in the shuttle bay, flanked by security officers and medical personnel. His expression was a carefully controlled mask of professional concern. Dr. Voss, he acknowledged stiffly. I'm relieved to see you alive, if not particularly pleased by your methods. The mission was a success, Commander, Kestra replied, stepping forward. I've made direct contact with the Vorak. They're not what we thought. So your transmission claimed? Zoran gestured to the medical team. You'll forgive me if I withhold judgment until after a thorough examination of all three of you. The next 12 hours were consumed by tests and debriefings, blood samples, neural scans, psychological evaluations, all designed to detect any lingering influence from the Vorak emissions. Kestra submitted to each procedure, patiently, knowing they were necessary steps in what would be a long process of validation. Finally, cleared for limited duty, she was summoned to the Intrepid's conference room. Zoran waited there, along with Koresh and Venth, both looking exhausted but clear-eyed. "Your neural patterns show significant changes," Zoran began without preamble, sliding a datapad across the table. "Increased activity in regions associated with pattern recognition, language processing, and empathic response." "Expected outcomes from the interface exposure," Kestre replied calmly. "The changes are stable, not degenerative." "So, Dr. Koresh has been explaining—" Zoran's gaze shifted to the neurolinguist. "She's also been analyzing the data you collected. Perhaps you'd care to summarize, Dr. Koresh." Koresh straightened in her seat. "The Vorak are a collective consciousness species with an unprecedented capacity for neural broadcasting. What we interpreted as attacks were actually attempts at communication, like shouting at someone you believe is deaf, not realizing you're rupturing their eardrums." "And now," Zoran asked, "you believe they've modulated their volume?" "They've recognized our limitations," Kestra said. "More importantly, they've revealed their true nature. The Vorak evolved as interspecies facilitators. They can bridge neural architectures that would otherwise be completely incompatible." Venth, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Commander, I went on this mission to ensure proper safety protocols. I was convinced we were undertaking an unnecessary risk." He removed his glasses, polishing them nervously. "I was wrong. The data is conclusive. The Vorak aren't predators. They're potentially the greatest diplomatic asset the Council has ever encountered." Zoran's expression remained skeptical. "A convenient discovery, Dr. Voss. One that happens to validate your reckless approach." "Not convenient," Kestra corrected. "Inevitable. The Vorak have been trying to make contact for centuries. We just never listened properly." "And now, you expect the Council to reclassify a species that has driven 17 crews to madness based on your single experience?" "No." Kestre leaned forward. "I expect them to evaluate the comprehensive data we've collected, conduct controlled follow-up missions with properly equipped personnel, and make an evidence-based decision." She smiled thinly. "That is how science works, Commander." The debate continued for hours as the Intrepid broke orbit, moving to a safe distance for transmission to the Council. The ship's communication officers worked through the night, compressing the enormous data package for faster-than-light transmission. By morning, the message was away. Now they could only wait for the Council's response. 3 weeks later, Kestri stood once again before the Galactic Council, this time at the center of the assessment chamber, rather than in the Terran delegation's bench. The tiered seating was filled to capacity, representatives from all 3,000 member species craning for a better view of the human who had touched the untouchable. Administrator Veltar presided, crystal appendages clicking with nervous energy. Beside Kestra stood Commander Zoran, Dr. Koresh, and Professor Venth, a united front despite their earlier disagreements. "The Council has reviewed the expedition data," Veltar announced, their translation unit struggling to convey the complex harmonics of Japhirian speech. "We have also consulted with experts in xenobiology, neuroscience, and diplomatic protocol from 17 member species." A murmur rippled through the chamber. 17. The same number as the ship's loss to the Vorak's influence over the decades. "The evidence suggests," Veltar continued, "that species 2998 may indeed be miscategorized. The neural architecture described in Dr. Voss's report indicates a species evolved for interspecies communication at a level previously unknown to the Council." Kestre maintained a neutral expression, though inside she felt a surge of vindication. "However," Veltar's tone sharpened, "one successful contact does not negate decades of documented adverse effects. The reclassification process Must proceed with caution. The Vorak understand our concerns, Kestra said, stepping forward. They've agreed to limit their transmissions to designated channels, using the modulation protocols we developed during the expedition. They're eager to demonstrate their potential as allies. Eager? Questioned a Melosian representative, tentacles rippling with skepticism. You attribute human emotions to a planetary consciousness? I translate concepts for which we have no perfect equivalents, Kestre replied. The Vorak exist to connect. Isolation is painful to them. They've respected our quarantine out of recognition of the harm their unfiltered presence caused. But they've never stopped trying to reach us. The ancient Peluvian delegate shifted on their cushion. And what do they seek from such connection, Dr. Voss? What benefit does a species of their apparent power gain from association with the Council? Diversity, Kestre answered simply. The Vorak experience reality through connection. Each new neural architecture they encounter expands their understanding of the universe. They don't want to consume or control. They want to translate, to bridge the unbridgeable gaps between radically different forms of consciousness. A noble claim, Veltar observed. Yet one that requires considerable faith to accept. Not faith, Commander Zorin interjected unexpectedly. Evidence. As a military officer, I approach this mission with maximum skepticism. The data changed my mind. It will change yours too, if you evaluate it objectively. The debate raged for days. Expert testimonies, data analyses, historical reviews, all culminating in a series of votes that gradually shifted the Vorak classification from apex predator to provisional diplomatic entity. It wasn't complete victory, but it was a beginning. The quarantine would be maintained, but with designated contact zones where properly equipped representatives could interact with the Vorak under controlled conditions. As the final protocols were being established, Administrator Veltar approached Kestra in the Council's diplomatic wing. The Terran Institute has nominated you for a new position, the Japhirian said without preamble. Ambassador of Silence. Kestra raised an eyebrow. Poetic, but inaccurate. The Vorak are anything but silent. The title refers to your role, not theirs, Veltar explained. Crystal limbs reflecting the ambient light. You will listen to what others cannot hear. Translate what cannot be spoken. Bridge what cannot be crossed. I'm a scientist, not a diplomat. You ceased being merely a scientist the moment you stepped onto the Vorak homeworld, Veltar countered. The Council needs individuals who can think beyond our established categories, who can see potential where others see only threat. Kestra considered the offer. She'd never sought administrative positions, preferring the freedom of research. Yet this role would allow her to continue working with the Vorak, expanding the translation protocols, exploring the vast potential of their neural interfaces. I have conditions, she said finally. A research team of my choosing, direct access to Council resources, and no bureaucratic obstacles to scientific inquiry. Veltar's crystalline form vibrated with what might have been amusement. You negotiate like a Japhirian, Dr. Voss. The Council will consider your terms. 6 months later, the first interspecies neural communication center opened on a neutral station orbiting the Vorak homeworld. Equipped with Kestra's refined interface technology and staffed by volunteers from 23 Council species, the center began the painstaking work of building a comprehensive translation matrix. Dr. Koresh led the Neurolinguistic Division, mapping the subtle distinctions between different species' neural architectures. Professor Venth, surprisingly, found his calling in developing safety protocols that protected without isolating, allowing controlled exposure that built tolerance over time. And Kestra, now officially the Ambassador of Silence, divided her time between the Center and the Council, advocating for further expansion of the program. The Vorak, she argued, were just the beginning. Throughout the galaxy, species classified as incompatible or dangerous might simply be miscategorized. their attempts at communication misinterpreted as threats. We built the council on the premise that diverse species could find common ground, she told a session of the newly formed Communication Evolution Committee. But we've limited ourselves to species that communicate in ways we already understand. The true test of our principles is whether we can embrace forms of consciousness that challenge our fundamental assumptions. Not everyone was convinced. Skeptics remained, particularly among species whose neural structures were most vulnerable to Vorak emissions. But as the translation matrix expanded, as more representatives experienced the filtered connection, opposition gradually diminished. 2 years after the expedition, Kestre stood in the observation dome of the Communication Center, watching as a delegation from the notoriously isolationist Trill Collective experienced their first Vorak connection. Through the transparent floor, she could see the swirling energy patterns of a Vorak node that had extended itself from the planet's surface specifically for this interaction. "They're responding well," Dr. Koresh noted, monitoring the neural feeds. "Heart rates elevated but within parameters. Cognitive functions stable. And look," she pointed to a specific data stream. "Bilateral communication established in under 3 minutes. A new record." Kestre smiled. "The Vorak are learning too. Each new species helps them refine their approach." "Ambassador," one of the junior technicians called from his station. "Incoming transmission from Council headquarters. Priority channel." Kestre nodded, moving to a private communication booth. Administrator Veltar's crystalline form shimmered on the display. "Ambassador Voss," the Japhirian greeted her. "The Council has reached a decision regarding your proposal." "That was faster than expected," Kestre replied, trying to read Veltar's notoriously difficult body language. "The evidence you've presented was compelling." A slight harmonic shift in Veltar's voice suggested something like reluctant admiration. "The apex predator classification will be formally reviewed for all quarantine species. Research expeditions utilizing your interface technology have been authorized for the 5 most promising candidates." It was more than Kestre had dared hope for. A fundamental shift in the Council's approach to new intelligences. "There is more," Veltar continued. "The Vorak have been granted provisional Council membership. Their unique abilities have already proven valuable in mediating disputes between the Melosian and Trill delegations, a conflict we believed intractable." "They were made for this," Kestre said softly. "Literally evolved to bridge impossible gaps." "Indeed." Veltar's crystalline form shifted in what might have been discomfort. "It seems we owe you an apology, Ambassador. Your unorthodox methods have yielded results that conventional diplomacy could not achieve." Kestre allowed herself a small smile. "No apology necessary, Administrator. We were all doing what we thought best for the Council. My approach simply involved a bit more direct experimentation." "A diplomatic response." Veltar's translation unit emitted the closest approximation of a chuckle it could manage. "Perhaps you've found your calling after all, Ambassador of Silence." After the transmission ended, Kestre returned to the observation dome. Below, the Trill delegation was concluding their session, their normally rigid forms now animated with unusual energy as they discussed their experience with Dr. Koresh. Commander Zoran, who had surprised everyone by requesting reassignment to the Communication Center's security detail, approached her. "Good news?" he asked, nodding toward the communication booth. "The best," Kestre replied. "The Council is expanding the program. 5 new expeditions. Full access to previously quarantined species." Zoran shook his head with a rueful smile. "They called you mad. You know, when the mission was first proposed, even I thought you were risking everything on a dangerous theory." "Sometimes, madness is just a label for ideas we're not ready to understand," Kestre said, watching as the Vorak energy patterns below shifted and swirled in their alien dance of consciousness. "Sometimes, The greatest danger isn't in reaching out. It's in refusing to listen when someone is trying desperately to be heard. As if in response to her words, the Vorak node pulsed with increased brightness, sending a focused beam of energy toward the observation dome. Not an attack, but a greeting, a conscious acknowledgement between allies. Kestra reached out mentally. The neural pathways established by her long exposure to the interface, allowing her to sense the familiar presence, even without direct connection. Bridge builder, came the concept. Faint but unmistakable. Silence interpreter. Future shaper. Yes, Kestra whispered, though she knew vocalization was unnecessary. That's exactly what we're doing. Together, they were building bridges across the silence between stars, transforming fear into understanding, isolation into connection. One consciousness at a time, they were reshaping the future of the galaxy. And it had all begun because one scientist refused to accept that silence meant absence. That difference meant danger, that the unknown must always be feared. Sometimes, Kestra reflected, as she watched new delegations arrive for their first contact, the maddest decision is the most profound. Sometimes, touching the untouchable is the only way to discover that what we feared most was exactly what we needed all along.